A sleek black car glides smoothly down a deserted highway at night, no speeding, no traffic violations. And yet, just minutes later, it's forced to stop under the blinding glare of red and blue lights, pulled over by a strange officer whose eyes gleam with suspicion. The woman behind the wheel isn't a criminal. She's not intoxicated. There is absolutely no reason to suspect her. She is Cassandra Miles, 52 years old, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. So why is one of the most powerful figures in national security being treated like a suspect, like someone who has no right to speak? What happens when the enforcer of the law becomes the victim of abuse of power? And what happens when every moment is caught on camera? You're about to witness a chilling true story where a single word, a single touch, or a single glance could mark the difference between justice and disaster. Don't take your eyes off the screen, because what happens next will forever change the way you view the badge and the power behind it. Under the still night sky, a sleek black sedan cruised smoothly along Interstate 47, a long, straight stretch of road with hardly another vehicle in sight at this hour. The streetlights cast pale yellow streaks across the windshield. Inside the car, Cassandra Miles, recently appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation just 3 months ago, gripped the steering wheel lightly with hands marked by time and experience. At 52 years old, Cassandra was the embodiment of composure and resilience, a woman who had lived through enough crises to know that danger doesn't always come with a clear shape. The classified meeting had run late. Sensitive topics still echoed in her mind: emerging threats, unverified intelligence. But that was the nature of the job. Cassandra didn't let emotions disturb her focus. To her, concentration was the sharpest weapon. She exhaled slowly, eyes flicking toward the digital clock on the dashboard. Nearly midnight. Then suddenly, flashing lights appeared behind her, red, blue, flashing endlessly. A patrol car tailgated her, its rooftop spotlight piercing the rearview mirror as if forcing her to react. Cassandra immediately glanced at her speedometer, 65 miles an hour, exactly the limit. No sudden lane changes, no signal violations. There was no reason to be pulled over. But decades in the field had taught her this: when there's no legitimate reason, the problem lies somewhere deeper and more dangerous. She turned on her signal, calmly guiding the car to the right shoulder. The patrol car stopped right behind her, lights still flashing. In that brief moment, Cassandra sensed something was off. Not because of the traffic stop, but because of her instinct. The same instinct that had saved her from ambushes and nighttime assassination attempts before. She placed both hands clearly on the wheel, visible, deliberate, rolled the window down, kept her eyes straight ahead, but no one got out. 1 minute passed, then 2, still nothing. The officer's delayed approach raised her alertness. She glanced at the side mirror and finally saw the patrol car's door open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, state trooper uniform, belt dangling with handcuffs and a regulation handgun. His left hand rested near his waist, fingers grazing the weapon's grip, not friendly, and certainly not standard for a routine stop. His right hand held a flashlight, sweeping back and forth like he was preparing for a hostile encounter. The beam of light landed directly on her face and stayed there too long to be called a check. Cassandra remained calm, her voice steady. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" No response. Only the sound of chewing gum, sharp and deliberate, and an examining stare. He took a step closer, flashlight still aimed directly at her eyes. Cassandra's heartbeat slowed, but her alertness surged. She had read hundreds of cases just like this. Encounters that began with ambiguity and ended in irreversible tragedy. There was no one else on the road tonight, no witnesses, no traffic cameras, just her and the composure forged through a lifetime of navigating threats. Cassandra Miles took a deep breath, preparing for whatever would come next, because she knew this was no longer just another ordinary night. The flashlight remained fixed on Cassandra Miles's face, forcing her to squint to maintain eye contact. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and dry, like a line from a script rehearsed too many times. Driver's license and vehicle registration. No greeting, no introduction, no explanation for pulling her over in the middle of the night. Cassandra gave a slight nod, her voice calm and steady, as if addressing a junior colleague. "I'll present them right away, officer. But first, may I ask, what offense have I committed?" The officer gave no answer. The flashlight continued to blaze. The silence stretched taut, thickening the air around them, as if he were searching for a final excuse to escalate. Cassandra slowly leaned toward the passenger seat, her hands raised high, a professional, deliberate motion trained into her as second nature. She retrieved her wallet and pulled out both her driver's license and her FBI identification card, the badge clearly displayed. "I am Director Cassandra Miles, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm returning from a late-night meeting. These are my credentials." She extended the documents out the window, holding them steady in the air, waiting for him to take them. But he didn't reach. The flashlight never moved from her face. His eyes glanced quickly at the FBI badge, then paused as if searching for a flaw, or perhaps weighing a decision that had nothing to do with the information on the card. "FBI, huh?" he sneered. "Anybody can print that kind of thing off the internet these days." The words dripped with sarcasm and with a deliberate tone of denial. Cassandra instantly recognized this wasn't ordinary procedural skepticism. It was targeted doubt, the kind she'd seen repeated in too many internal complaints throughout her career. "You're welcome to contact the nearest dispatch station," Cassandra replied politely. "My credentials are registered at the federal level." But the officer simply shook his head, a cold smile playing on his lips, his expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle, now!" The command came with crisp authority, no explanation, no reason given, no indication that he intended to follow proper traffic stop protocol. "Excuse me?" Cassandra asked, her eyes narrowing. "I have not been informed whether I'm being detained or investigated for any reason." The officer, she now caught the name on his chest. Lieutenant Brent Rollins remained still, neither backing off nor stepping closer. His left hand hovered near the grip of his holstered gun, a silent gesture but laced with threat. "I said step out of the vehicle, now!" No citation. No verbal warning, no verification process, only vague hostility, wrapped in a law enforcement uniform, shielded by the darkness of an empty road. Cassandra felt a chill slide down her spine, not out of fear, but from the chilling awareness that she was now caught in a moment where power could be abused by the very person sworn to uphold the law. She stayed composed, her gaze locked on Lieutenant Rollins. On one side was her survival instinct, honed over decades of facing dangerous situations. On the other was reason and the law, both of which she represented. In just a few minutes, a routine traffic stop without cause had turned into a tense standoff, one where the smallest misstep in response could lead to irreversible consequences. And Cassandra knew that truth better than anyone. The space inside the car felt frozen in time, with nothing but the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windshield. Cassandra Miles kept both hands on the steering wheel, her fingers tightening slightly, but her eyes remained unnervingly calm. She was no stranger to pressure, no stranger to moments where the line between life and death was as thin as a breath. But never had she imagined she'd have to summon that same composure. On her own soil, on an ordinary road, facing those in the same uniform as the people she'd spent her life working alongside. "I will not step out of this vehicle unless you provide a legitimate reason," Cassandra said, her voice low and clear, not a single tremble in her tone. "I haven't violated any traffic law, and I've already presented valid identification." Brent Rollins smirked a crooked smile that couldn't mask the simmering irritation in his eyes. In that brief instant, Cassandra saw it clearly. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was a display of power, where logic had no place. Suddenly, Rollins slammed his hand against the roof of her car. The sharp clang of metal echoed through the night, slicing the already tense air like a knife. "I don't need a reason," he growled. "I give orders. You hear me?" Cassandra didn't respond. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, her gaze steady, as if she were facing a congressional hearing, not a midnight intimidation ritual. She knew that a single misstep, one wrong move, could send everything spiraling out of control. Just then, another patrol car slid in behind the scene, its lights sweeping across the pavement. The door opened, and another officer stepped out, taller, younger, imposing. Though he hadn't said a word yet, his silence carried weight. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his eyes darting between Rollins and Cassandra. Rollins didn't miss a beat. His tone was certain, as if the outcome had already been decided. "This woman is non-compliant. She's refusing orders. Might be impersonating a federal agent." The new officer Cassandra could now make out his name tag. Eric Malloy glanced briefly at her, then at the FBI badge still resting beneath the window. But instead of investigating, he nodded slightly toward Rollins, a silent gesture of agreement. No questions, no signs of caution, just blind trust in a colleague or quiet complicity. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle, immediately," Malloy said, his voice colder than the first. There was no more room for doubt. These men weren't after the truth. They were searching for justification, anything to assert their dominance, no matter the cost. Cassandra swallowed a wave of anger rising in her throat. She knew all too well. One sudden move, a lean for her phone, a glance downward to fix her shoe could be labeled resisting. She'd read hundreds of such reports. She'd felt indignation for the victims, but now she was living the scenario. Malloy stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of his belt. Rollins circled to the passenger side as if preparing to forcibly open the door and drag her out. Cassandra took a deep breath. Her heart pounded, but her control held. This was no longer just a situation, it was a test of resolve, of character, and of survival. And Cassandra Miles, director of the FBI, age 52, seasoned in national crises, would not allow herself to become a name scratched off in a cold internal report come morning. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, and she waited, in silence, for a flicker of light, for a sign that justice still existed here, in the middle of the night, with two hands near holstered guns. The chill of the highway night crept through the slightly open window, brushing against Cassandra Miles's skin. But it wasn't as biting as the tension unraveling outside the vehicle where two police officers closed in tightly around a 52-year-old woman, her hands still on the wheel, heart pounding, but eyes burning bright with resolve. Cassandra had never imagined that those emergency drills where every second was simulated like a real-world crisis would one day become so useful here on American soil and for herself. She remembered vividly the first time she attended a crisis response training at Quantico. The instructor back then had said something she'd never forgotten. In any situation, even with a gun to your head, the first person to lose control is the one who loses. And now, she was facing not just one but two invisible weapons: suspicion, prejudice, and a distorted sense of authority disguised as justice. Rollins remained in place, hand near his weapon, eyes sharp like someone itching for a reason to act. Eric Malloy hovered like a shadow, silent, yet no less threatening, standing in the perfect spot to block any possible retreat. For a few brief seconds, Cassandra allowed herself to feel something instructors always warned against: the anger of being humiliated, the fear of realizing that her life could be taken away with a single poor decision from someone outside her control, and the bitter sorrow of knowing this wasn't just about her. Cassandra Miles was the director of the FBI. But if the woman sitting in that car tonight had been a teacher, a nurse, or simply a single mother driving home from a late shift, would the situation have been any different? No. Because the one thing that made these two officers act like she was dangerous wasn't her badge, it was her skin color. That thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. And yet, in that very moment, Cassandra remembered the names she had read in internal investigation reports. The faces that would never speak again. The footage capturing the final moments of people who were never given the chance to explain, only to be judged. They never had a chance. But she did. She couldn't let fear rob her of reason, couldn't let outrage strip her of dignity, and she absolutely could not let those two men write the ending to this story, because she was still alive, still breathing, and still had the truth on her side. Cassandra slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Rollins through the side window. It was no longer the gaze of a lone woman, but of a generation, of people who had stayed silent too long and were now beginning to speak. She spoke each word deliberate, clear, and unwavering. "If you continue to violate procedure, I will consider this an abuse of power, and I will pursue full accountability." Rollins squinted, but this time, he didn't take another step forward. Cassandra knew she had just regained a sliver of control, not through force, but through clarity and courage. A tactic forged over decades of negotiating with criminals, now repurposed to defend herself, right here, in the very country she had sworn to protect. And in that moment, Cassandra Miles silently vowed, "I will not fall, not just for me, but for everyone who never got the chance to rise." In the stretched silence between two heartbeats, Cassandra Miles knew she had stepped into the gray zone between life and death, a space where a single movement too swift, a word too sharp, or a glance misunderstood could unravel everything beyond control. She stood still, spine straight, eyes following every movement of Lieutenant Brent Rollins. Not because she wasn't afraid. On the contrary, fear was burning low and steady in her chest like a smoldering ember. But that fear was exactly what made her more focused than ever. "Turn around," Rollins repeated, voice low and heavy with pressure. Cassandra didn't respond. She held her position, arms raised to chest level, palms open, a gesture signaling she was unarmed, non-threatening, simply trying to retain the last shred of safety she could still control. "Lieutenant," she said calmly, her voice slow and deliberate, paced with her breath. "I have not been informed of any reason for detainment. I request that you follow procedure and take your hand off your weapon." Rollins didn't answer. He took one step closer. And then, his hand suddenly clamped down on her left wrist. The grip was so tight her bones felt like they might crack. Cassandra reflexively tilted her body, a pure, trained response, but she stopped herself, forcing her body to resist the instinctive counter-move before it fully formed. Fighting back, however justified by instinct, could become the perfect excuse for a bullet that required no explanation. "Let go," Cassandra said, voice steady but not defiant. "I am not resisting, but you are seriously exceeding your authority." Rollins tightened his grip. The silence on the road blanketed the moment like a freezing fog. Eric Malloy, the second officer, said nothing. He simply stood there, silent as the darkness. And Cassandra knew that silence was more dangerous than a scream. Then suddenly, Rollins let go, but only to do something worse. His right hand slid to his hip so quickly it was almost imperceptible. A chilling click pierced the air as the holster's retention strap snapped open. And then, the black barrel of a gun was aimed directly at Cassandra's forehead. No one screamed. No one intervened. Malloy just stood there, eyes fixed on the weapon. Cassandra looked straight down the barrel less than a meter away. In an instant, faces flashed through her mind. Innocent people, shot dead just for pulling out a wallet, turning their head too fast, or simply existing in the wrong color. But she didn't lower her gaze. "I am the director of the FBI," Cassandra said, without hesitation. "And if you pull that trigger, it won't just be my life that's lost. It will be your career, your reputation, and whatever's left of your conscience." Rollins froze in place, hands still gripping the gun, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Across the road, a faint light suddenly glowed, a phone screen perhaps. Someone, a bystander, was quietly recording. Cassandra noticed, but showed no reaction. Instead, she kept her gaze locked on Rollins, her eyes silently saying, "Go ahead, but know the world is watching." In that bone-chilling silence, the wind rustled through the roadside trees like whispers of justice, waiting to be spoken. And Cassandra, fully aware she was standing on the edge of a precipice, held her breath steady because that breath, in that moment, was the last thread tying her to life, and to the right to simply exist. In the taut silence, where a single bullet could have ended everything, a voice rang out, not loud, but clear and resolute, like a bell cutting through the suffocating air. "I'm recording this." The voice came from the roadside, where a man stood under the dim glow of a streetlight, phone held high, its screen glowing bright like a beacon shining into the darkness of abusive power. Lieutenant Brent Rollins flinched slightly, his hand still gripping the gun, but his gaze flicked away from Cassandra to glance quickly toward the voice. The surprise was evident in his furrowed brow, in the breath that suddenly caught in his chest. The man stepped forward, not hastily but with purpose. It was David Tran, a Vietnamese-American engineer just off his night shift, who had happened to drive by and sensed something was wrong when he saw two patrol cars blocking an otherwise deserted stretch of road. He pulled over, instinctively turning on his phone camera from afar. "What are you doing?" Officer Eric Malloy asked, his voice a mix of unease and wariness. David didn't look away from the screen, his grip steady. "I'm filming, because what's happening here isn't right, and I believe I won't be the only one watching this." Rollins darted his eyes between Cassandra and David. His hand hadn't lowered the weapon, but the look in his eyes had begun to waver. A soft clicking sound came from David's phone, the audible confirmation that it was recording. The world was now watching. Cassandra stood her ground, hands still raised, steady and unwavering. In that moment, she didn't just represent herself, she stood for the millions who had been deemed unfit, who had been placed under the barrel of a gun simply because their existence made someone with a badge uncomfortable. "You should lower the weapon," David said, this time directly to Rollins, his voice calm but firm. "Because if you don't, you won't just have to answer to your department, but to the whole country, to justice, and to your own conscience." Rollins pressed his lips together, his gaze torn. The presence of a civilian witness, someone outside the chain of command, beyond the power structure, simply a citizen, had disrupted the entire dynamic he believed he controlled. Malloy stepped back, clearly no longer as certain as he had been minutes ago. He leaned toward Rollins and whispered something low, too quiet for anyone else to hear, but clear enough for Cassandra to see the shift. They were no longer in control. The air felt suspended in time. On one side, a gun still not lowered. On the other, a phone still recording, every second, every frame, capturing an unarguable truth. And in between stood Cassandra Miles, 52 years old, director of the FBI, an unarmed black woman, not shouting, not trembling, only steady and resolute, standing like a tower in the eye of a storm. "I advise you both," she said, voice gentle but firm. "Think very carefully, because every action you take from this moment will be remembered not just in an internal report, but in the consciousness of a nation that is waking up." The wind stirred, rustling the trees along the road like the quiet applause of truth drawing near. Rollins stared at Cassandra for several more seconds, and finally his hand slowly lowered the gun. No apology, no admission of guilt, just the retreat of a man forced back by the light of truth from the shadows he had long called familiar. Cassandra exhaled a breath so quiet, yet the breath of someone who had just preserved her life and reclaimed a sliver of justice in a place where doing the right thing often only survives when someone is willing to stand up and press record. The first sound to pierce the silence was a siren wailing in the distance, faint at first, like an echo in the night, but growing clearer, closer, stronger with each passing second. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, scattering across the dark road like a declaration. The balance of power was shifting. The lead SUV in the convoy screeched to a halt, and its doors flung open. Out stepped a woman in a sharply pressed police uniform, walking with decisive strides, her eyes sharp as a freshly honed blade. Captain Rosa Delaney, regional commander overseeing the Western Highway Corridor, and once a close training partner of Cassandra Miles during anti-terrorism drills years ago. No questions needed, no guessing required. At a glance, she understood this was no routine traffic stop. Rollins spun around as the convoy arrived, instinctively stepping back as the headlights lit up his face, exposing every trace of tension and fear hiding beneath his arrogant exterior. A young officer from Delaney's team, just stepping out of his vehicle, froze as his flashlight illuminated Cassandra's face. He gasped, voice filled with awe and reverence. "Director Miles?" In that moment, the silence shattered. Everyone who hadn't yet understood what was happening suddenly shifted. That name, Director Cassandra Miles, wasn't just a title. It carried the full weight of an entire justice system. A woman who held the highest position in federal investigation, no one didn't know who she was. Rosa Delaney strode forward, her eyes quickly scanning Cassandra to confirm her condition, then turned sharply to face Rollins and Malloy. Her voice cut through the night like steel dropped on concrete. "Disarm yourselves. You are both being detained for gross procedural misconduct and endangering the life of a high-ranking federal official." Rollins opened his mouth to protest. But Rosa raised her hand firmly. "No explanations are accepted at the scene. We have a witness, we have footage, and we have a federal director who had a gun pointed at her in the middle of the night." Eric Malloy, who had hesitated throughout, lowered his gaze. His clenched hands were cold, but not colder than the eyes now fixed on him, not from subordinates, but from those who knew exactly where justice stood tonight. Cassandra remained still beneath the hazy glow of the headlights, saying nothing. But her silence carried weight. It wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of power waiting for accountability to do its part. Rosa turned to Cassandra, her eyes firm, yet respectful. "Director, do you have any specific orders?" Cassandra gave a slight nod. No shouting, no fist-pounding, no outrage. Just one sentence, precise and icy. "Take them to headquarters, and tell Internal Affairs I want a full incident report within 12 hours. As her words landed, two officers from Delaney's team stepped forward. Rollins now stood stripped of arrogance, just a slumped shadow facing the consequences of his own actions. His hands were cuffed behind him, the clink of metal echoing dry and final, like the tolling of a bell signaling a new chapter not in Cassandra's life, but in a force that once believed power came without restraint. Cassandra turned to look at David Tran, the ordinary man who did the extraordinary with nothing more than a phone. Their eyes met for a moment. No words were spoken. Just a silent understanding between two strangers who shared the same belief. Truth only needs a single light and someone brave enough to keep it burning. The phone in David Tran's hand was still recording, the tiny red light blinking in the corner of the screen like a silent warning that could not be ignored. Every action, every word, every boundary crossed had been captured. As Rosa Delaney turned back, David stepped forward, his eyes still fixed on Cassandra. "Director," he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet indignation. "This is the video I recorded from the moment Lieutenant Rollins ordered you out of the car without explanation, up until the point when he drew his weapon." He held the phone out toward Delaney. A few officers stepped forward to take it, one of them swiping across the screen to verify the footage. Only a few seconds passed in silence, but they were heavy-weighted like the collective breath of everyone holding still in shared tension. The video began to play, and the first sound was unmistakable. Rollins barking at Cassandra to step out of the vehicle, followed by the bang of his palm slamming the car roof, and then the scene of her being pulled from the vehicle, her hands never having left the steering wheel. The patrol car headlights illuminated the faces around them, casting jagged shadows like firelight flickering through shattered glass, raw, sharp, and unforgiving. When the footage reached the moment Rollins pointed the gun directly at Cassandra, a sharp gasp came from a young officer standing beside Delaney. Delaney glanced through several clips, then lifted her eyes to Cassandra, awaiting orders. But Cassandra wasn't looking at her. Her gaze was fixed on Rollins and Malloy, who now stood stripped of arrogance. Rollins' face was pale, sweat glistening at his temples, his eyes darting like a trapped animal, sensing there was no way out. Cassandra pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. When the call was answered, her voice rang clear, sharp like a blade honed by decades of experience. "This is Director Cassandra Miles. I am ordering an immediate full internal investigation into Lieutenant Brent Rollins and Officer Eric Malloy. I want all disciplinary records, psychological evaluations, civilian complaints, and any documented incidents of misconduct on my desk within 6 hours." She hung up without waiting for confirmation. Silence spread outward like waves hitting a beach, drowning any justification before it could form. Rollins shifted, trying to lift his head as if to speak, but Cassandra simply turned to Delaney and said, in a voice not loud but firm enough to make everyone hold their breath, "Cuff them." Delaney didn't hesitate. 2 officers stepped forward this time, not to intervene but to enforce the law. As the cold steel handcuffs locked around Rollins' wrists, he blurted out, "I was acting on instinct. I didn't know who she was." Cassandra didn't even glance at him. "That you didn't care who I was is exactly the problem." Malloy didn't resist. He just bowed his head. But that was no longer a gesture of respect. It was the weight of defeat and fear. David Tran remained where he was, witnessing everything. Cassandra turned to him for the first time since the incident began, and her voice softened. "Thank you. Your video didn't just save me, it saved the truth." David shook his head, his voice quiet but resolute. "I only did what everyone should have done." In the distance, the patrol cars still flashed, their lights reflecting on the asphalt like fragments of memory passing through a night of upheaval. But now, the truth was no longer buried in shadow. It had been exposed, undeniable, unshakable. And those who once believed themselves above the law were now left with cold steel cuffs and the unblinking gaze of justice upon them. Just hours after the video David Tran sent to the senior officer team was forwarded to the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a copy began spreading across social media like wildfire sweeping through dry grass. No sensational headline, no lengthy caption, just a 2-minute video showing a black woman standing between 2 white police officers, one of whom was pointing a gun at her in chilling silence. The FBI badge on her chest did nothing to deter him. His face was ice cold, his eyes filled only with contempt, and then came the voice of the person recording from off-screen. "I'm filming this." That moment alone was enough for viewers to understand something deeply wrong was happening. Within one night, the video was shared over 2 million times. From ordinary citizens to politicians, journalists, lawyers, veterans, and social justice advocates, everyone saw clearly. This wasn't a case of professional misunderstanding. This was a systematic assault on both the identity and dignity of a woman tasked with upholding the law. By the following morning, the first press release from the Department of Justice was issued with a bold headline: "Criminal investigation launched into incident involving FBI Director Cassandra Miles." Not long after, a spokesperson confirmed that Lieutenant Brent Rollins had been taken into custody to support the investigation into armed threat and abuse of authority during the execution of his duties. Officer Eric Malloy, who had been present and failed to intervene, was officially suspended indefinitely pending disciplinary action. Across briefing rooms, hallways, and internal forums of law enforcement agencies, the incident was being discussed as an unprecedented storm. Why her? How could two officers fail to recognize the director of the FBI? But then came the more pressing question reflected in every glance. If this could happen to the head of a federal agency, what about ordinary citizens? Several media outlets called it a modern-day Rosa Parks moment, not because Cassandra Miles refused to sit in the back of a bus, but because she refused to bow to a system accustomed to dealing in injustice. Primetime news programs replayed the video repeatedly, with a caption that read, "She raised her hands not to surrender, but to protect her dignity." Dozens of social organizations, bar associations, and even former leaders of law enforcement units spoke out in support of Cassandra, calling for sweeping reforms in police oversight mechanisms. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForMiles became the #1 trending topic in the US within just 4 hours. Yet amid the rising tide of outrage and support, Cassandra Miles chose silence. She didn't appear on television. She made no statements to the press, because to her, justice does not reside in passionate posts or empty promises. Justice is tangible action. It is reopening case files. It is reforming protocols. It is holding public officials accountable. And now, inside her office on the top floor of FBI headquarters, Cassandra sat at her desk, eyes focused on the latest investigation report from the Department of Justice. Outside her window, the morning sun had risen, casting a soft glow across the pages. She knew this wasn't over. But she also knew one thing for certain: justice had begun to speak, and this time, no one would be able to silence it again. Weeks after the highway incident that shook the nation, FBI Director Cassandra Miles appeared before the media at the Department of Justice headquarters not with a face of outrage or resentment, but with the calm composure of someone who understood that the real battle was only just beginning. She stood tall at the podium, behind her a banner with a simple yet powerful phrase: the Straight Line Initiative. "We cannot fix a system by simply replacing a few rusty bolts," Cassandra began, her voice ringing clearly through the room packed with reporters, activists, law enforcement representatives, and federal agency officials. "We have to redraw the entire route a straight line, one that does not bend for power, nor stray due to prejudice." The Straight Line Initiative was introduced as a nationwide reform campaign not only for the FBI but extended to all local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. The program aimed to rebuild behavioral standards, increase independent oversight, eliminate the culture of abuse of power, and most critically mandate training scenarios that incorporate emergency responses involving racial and gender-based bias. Cassandra emphasized, "Discipline is necessary, but education is what truly transforms. Because a gun is not as dangerous as a mind unaware of the consequences of its own actions." One of the most talked about elements of the initiative was the inclusion of David Tran, the bystander, who recorded the viral video that turned the entire situation around. David, a Vietnamese-American tech engineer, never imagined that pulling over that night and holding up his phone would make him a symbol of civil rights. But it was precisely that split-second decision that saved a life, and now might help save a system. As part of the Straight Line, David was invited to serve as a civilian witness advisor, directly participating in the design of real-time scenario training for both new recruits and active officers. In instructional videos, he appears on camera, recounting his experience not as an accusation, but as a statement of truth. "I'm not a hero," he often says. "I'm just a citizen who knew I had rights and the responsibility to use them when it mattered." The program also included the development of a tech-based platform that allows civilians to rate and report law enforcement interactions and conduct during stops or investigations. Each officer would be assigned a transparent ID code, ensuring all feedback is formally processed and stored. Not everyone was enthusiastic about these changes. Inside the ranks, some felt threatened, felt the system was being turned against them. But Cassandra knew full well, every transformation must begin with discomfort, especially for those who have grown too accustomed to the privilege of silence. At the press conference concluding the initiative's launch, when asked how she managed to remain so composed and resolute after that night, Cassandra simply smiled, her eyes shifting toward the row where David sat with his family. "Because I understand one thing," she said. "Justice never happens quietly. It needs to be spoken. And if no one speaks, then at the very least record it. Record the truth, so the world can no longer look away." The camera lights blinked, casting their glow on the 52-year-old woman who had crossed the line between position and purpose, becoming a symbol of an era. But Cassandra had no interest in the title. For her, only one thing mattered. The truth had been told, and this time it would not be buried in silence. Cassandra Miles did not back down. She didn't scream, didn't resist, but she also didn't bow her head. Through calm composure, intellect, and the resolve of a woman who had walked the corridors of the highest power in America, she turned a night of injustice into the catalyst for sweeping reform. But the truth is, without David Tran's camera, this entire incident might have faded into silence, like so many others. Justice does not arrive on its own. It requires courage to speak up, and sometimes it only takes one person willing to hit record. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments. Let your voice become the light that shines into the darkness. If you believe that power must be held accountable and that justice should not be defined by skin color or job title, hit like, share, and subscribe to help us spread these stories of courage where light always has a chance to triumph over darkness. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're still with us. Where are you from? Add your city in the comments, we'd love to know. Thank you for watching this story. See you in the next video where more truths are waiting to be told.